Everyone thinks Taylor Swift is untouchable, but the one mistake that almost ended her career still haunts her today. Because the truth is, Taylor Swift was never built in comfort. She was built in tension, in contradiction, in the painful distance between how the world saw her and who she was trying to become. People look at the sold-out stadiums, the screaming fans, the endless headlines, the awards, the private planes, the cultural dominance, and the billion-dollar numbers, and they assume they are looking at a woman who rose in a straight line. But Taylor Swift's life did not move in a straight line. It lurched, it doubled back, it caught fire, it collapsed in public, and rebuilt itself in private, again and again. That is what makes her story impossible to ignore. It is not just a success story. It is a reinvention story, a survival story, a story about a girl who wanted something enormous before she had the language to explain how enormous it was. A story about what happens when someone not only becomes famous, but becomes a symbol so early that the symbol starts competing with the person. At the center of it all is a paradox that never stopped shaping her life. The very thing that made Taylor Swift powerful was the same thing that kept leaving her exposed. She noticed everything. She remembered everything. She wrote everything down. She could take a crush, a betrayal, a look across the room, a night drive, a voicemail, or a broken promise, and turn it into something millions of people suddenly recognized as their own life. That gift made her one of the most successful artists of her generation. It also made her one of the most misunderstood. Before the albums and the eras and the cultural wars, before the mythology became too large to hold in one body, there was just a girl in Pennsylvania with a restless imagination and a strange, almost unnerving level of focus. Taylor Allison Swift grew up in a world that looked ordinary from the outside, but never felt ordinary to her. Ordinary life was material. It was texture. It was story. She was the kind of child who seemed to watch life while also living it, as if one part of her was always converting experience into language. She loved words before the world ever paid for them. She loved stories before she understood that stories could build empires. She was drawn to songs that did more than sound good. She wanted songs that said something precise, songs that named emotion instead of circling around it. Country music reached her early because country music respected detail. It told you who left, where they stood, what the road looked like, and what the silence felt like. That matched something essential in Taylor. She was never satisfied by vague feeling. She wanted emotional architecture. She wanted to know how a song could make a private ache feel public without losing its intimacy. And once that question took hold of her, it never let go. The first sign of what she would become was not glamour. It was persistence. She did not dream like a tourist. She dreamed like a builder. There was a seriousness to it. Not a fantasy of being admired, but an obsession with becoming good enough that admiration would have to follow. She did not want to be near music. She wanted to make it. She did not want to stand beside fame. She wanted authorship. That word matters more than almost any other word in her life. Authorship. It sounds obvious now, because Taylor Swift is so strongly associated with songwriting that people forget how hard she had to insist on it in the beginning. The industry has always had room for young women who can be packaged. It has been far less eager to empower young women who insist on writing their own material, shaping their own image, and protecting the internal mechanism of their own story. A girl with curls and a guitar could be charming. A teenage girl who wanted control over the words coming out of her mouth was something else. That was power. And power, when it shows up in young women, tends to make gatekeepers uneasy. Still, Taylor kept pushing. The move toward Nashville became the first major leap in her story. For most children, big dreams stay abstract because the geography never changes. But her family saw that something about Taylor's ambition had real weight. This was not a phase. It was central. It was who she was. So Nashville entered the picture, not as a fantasy postcard, but as a destination that could be approached strategically. That is another truth people often miss about Taylor Swift. Her story has always contained two forces at once: intense emotion and intense discipline. She was never just a diarist spilling feelings into the air. She was organized, alert, willing to repeat effort until effort became identity. The emotional power of her songs can make listeners feel they are hearing something spontaneous and immediate. But behind that immediacy was labor. She wrote relentlessly. She observed relentlessly. She refined. Nashville did not simply welcome her with open arms. It evaluated her. It tested how much of her drive was real. The city was full of gifted people. Better singers, arguably, people with more obvious technical advantages, stronger conventional credentials, deeper local roots. Taylor's edge was not perfection. It was point of view. She wrote like someone her age, but with the compositional instincts of someone who already understood audience psychology. She knew how to make young emotions feel significant. She did not condescend to teenage feeling. She treated it as worthy of craft. That was radical in its own quiet way. Teenage girls are usually treated as a market. Taylor wrote as one of them and for them, but without flattening them into stereotypes. Her songs did not talk down to the emotional stakes of adolescence. They understood that what adults dismiss as trivial can feel world-ending when you are living it. A hallway glance, a missed call, a party invitation, a betrayal between friends. The first time a boy makes you feel foolish for caring too much. These things are not small when they are happening. Taylor wrote from inside that scale of feeling. That made girls feel understood. It also made adults underestimate what she was actually doing. Because while they were laughing at diary pages, she was building loyalty. Her early songs spread because they did not feel imported from above. They felt lived. They felt like someone had finally translated the emotional weather of growing up into lyrics that were direct without being dumb, dramatic without being false. That bond with the audience became the foundation of everything that followed. Taylor did not simply release songs into the world. She created a relationship with listeners that felt participatory. She hid clues. She planted references. She made liner notes matter. She invited decoding. Long before fandom became a round-the-clock interpretive culture, Taylor understood that people wanted to feel not only entertained, but addressed. Her work said, "I see you seeing me. Come closer." It was brilliant. It was intimate. It was also dangerous. Because once you train the world to look closely, the world does not know when to stop. It begins with clues and lyrics, and ends with strangers reading your facial expressions, your silences, your relationships, your friendships, your outfit choices, and your every public move as if they are solving a case. Taylor Swift, perhaps more than any star of her generation, taught audiences that meaning could be hidden everywhere. Years later, that same audience, along with critics and tabloids, would look for meaning everywhere and call it truth. But in the beginning, it felt thrilling. Her debut era introduced her as something unusual, a teenage songwriter who seemed uncannily fluent in her own emotional language. The image was instantly legible. Curls, guitar, sincerity, a kind of all-American brightness that looked effortless from a distance, but was already being managed with intelligence up close. She was young enough to be underestimated and sharp enough to know how to use that underestimation. People saw sweetness. They saw relatability. They saw a nice girl with a gift. Fewer saw the machine already taking shape underneath. Because Taylor was not passively entering the industry. She was studying it. She watched what worked, what did not, who got to stay, who vanished, which women were adored, which were mocked, what kind of femininity the culture rewarded, and what it punished. She was learning the grammar of stardom in real time, and she was already trying to write herself into it on her own terms. Then came the first real ignition. Fearless did not just succeed. It enlarged her. It took what had been promising and made it undeniable. Suddenly, Taylor Swift was no longer just a talented young country singer-songwriter with a devoted fan base. She was becoming something much bigger, a generational figure, an emotional translator for millions of listeners who felt as if she had found a way to turn their private humiliations into public hymns. The genius of Fearless was its balance. It was romantic without being empty, idealistic without being naive, full of glitter and fairy tale symbolism. Yes, but also threaded with fear, longing, insecurity, and that uniquely adolescent mixture of certainty and confusion. Taylor understood something that many songwriters never master. Fantasy only works if you also include the crack running through it. A dream becomes emotionally convincing when the listener senses how easily it could break. That is why those songs traveled so far. They did not simply celebrate love. They dramatized wanting it so badly that wanting itself became a kind of danger. They made hope sound thrilling and embarrassing at once. That is a very hard emotional frequency to capture. Taylor captured it so well that listeners did not merely enjoy the music. They inhabited it. And suddenly, she was everywhere. With scale came validation. Awards, attention, adult respect, or at least the performance of it. But fame does not just bring validation. It brings simplification. The bigger a person becomes, the more the culture tries to reduce them to a shape it can process quickly. Taylor was rapidly becoming a star, and the world was beginning to decide what kind of star she was. That decision would matter more than she knew. Because when the culture gives a young woman a role, it does so conditionally. You may be the sweetheart, the innocent, the golden girl, the wounded romantic, the earnest one, but the role is not protection. It is probation. The minute you show a trait the audience does not think belongs in that role, ambition, anger, pride, strategic intelligence, vanity, erotic agency, they begin to turn. Taylor had not yet learned the full violence of that mechanism. She would. First, she would be interrupted in a way so public and surreal that it would become part of modern mythology. The 2009 MTV Video Music Awards should have been a clean milestone. A young artist winning, glowing, stepping into one more dream fulfilled. Instead, it became one of those rare moments when an entire culture seemed to inhale at once. Taylor went on stage to accept an award, and in the space of seconds, Kanye West walked up, took the microphone, and turned her celebration into a global humiliation. That image endured because it was narratively perfect in the cruelest possible way. A young woman, visibly stunned, a public violation, a room full of shocked witnesses, a moment that could be clipped, replayed, memed, argued over, and frozen forever in the collective imagination. Taylor, in that instant, ceased being just a singer. She became a symbol. The girl interrupted. The innocent cut off mid-sentence. The one the world suddenly wanted to protect. And at first, that protection helped her. Sympathy flooded in. The moment humanized her at scale. People who had not thought much about Taylor Swift before now had an emotional entry point into her story. She seemed vulnerable, gracious, wronged. The image intensified the qualities people already projected onto her. Sweetness, dignity, fragility, composure. It made her easier to love. But symbols always come with a trap. Once the culture installs you as innocent, it also begins waiting for the moment you fail the role. Innocence is a dangerous costume because it leaves no room for ordinary complexity. And Taylor, like any actual human being, contained much more than innocence. She was ambitious, competitive, image-aware, hurt easily, exceptionally driven, proud of her work, strategic in her self-presentation. Those things did not contradict her sweetness, but they complicated it. And culture has a habit of turning complexity into evidence of deceit. For the moment, though, she kept rising. Speak Now carried a different energy. If Fearless expanded her, Speak Now sharpened her. It felt more pointed, more intentional, more like a young artist, insisting that she was not just a pretty surface onto which other people could project a story. Writing the songs herself, she made a statement about authorship that was both artistic and symbolic. She was speaking now, not later, not through someone else, not through interpretation, through her own pen. This insistence on authorship reveals a deeper anxiety underneath everything. She feared being spoken for. She feared being narrated by others. That fear makes sense when you look at how her career unfolded. The more visible she became, the more people tried to explain her back to herself. Critics flattened her into cliches. Tabloids turned her into a caricature. Industry figures alternated between praising her talent and dismissing her seriousness. She was listened to by millions and still often not heard on her own terms. So she kept writing more precisely, more forcefully, more personally. At the same time, the culture's first major gendered backlash against her was already gathering. Male artists had built entire legacies from heartbreak songs, obsession songs, revenge songs, and songs of regret. No one turned that into a joke about their character. But Taylor's romantic writing became a punchline. She was reduced to the girl who writes songs about boys. Her craft was trivialized by the exact intimacy that made it powerful. People began treating her songwriting not as composition, but as gossip. It was one of the earliest and clearest demonstrations of a double standard that would follow her for years. When men write about women, it is universal. When Taylor wrote about men, it was supposedly petty, confessional in the wrong way, too emotional, too specific, too revealing. And yet the songs kept proving their power precisely because of that specificity. The details were not cheap gossip. They were emotional anchors. Still, even success does not stop narrative distortion once it starts. Taylor's dating life became a media obsession, not because it was uniquely chaotic, but because it was narratively useful. Every new relationship gave the press a character, the audience a theory, and critics another excuse to reduce her complexity to a stereotype they could recycle endlessly. She was too famous for privacy and too lyrical for discretion in the eyes of people who did not understand that songs are made of emotional truth, not courtroom testimony. The more she wrote, the more they acted as if she owed them an explanation. The more she succeeded, the more they implied that she had succeeded through emotional spectacle, instead of discipline and craft. This was the atmosphere into which Red arrived. If Fearless was the dream, and Speak Now the declaration, Red was the fracture. It sounded like someone standing in the ruins of certainty, trying to sort feeling into categories and failing beautifully. The genre lines blurred. The emotional lines blurred. Youth gave way to early adulthood, and with it came a messier, more destabilizing understanding of love. Not the fairy tale, not the hallway fantasy, something more disorienting, something that could exhilarate and humiliate in the same week. Red mattered because it embraced contradiction rather than resolving it. It understood that heartbreak is often not elegant. It is jagged. It is repetitive. It is embarrassing. It makes you sound irrational in your own head. One part of you wants to preserve the memory. Another wants to destroy it. Another wants to pretend it never mattered. Another wants to call in the middle of the night anyway. Taylor translated that instability into songs that felt both immediate and immense. This was also the album that made it harder for serious listeners to ignore the scale of her songwriting gift. She could write devastation in broad cinematic strokes, then narrow it to one devastating image. She could do irony, nostalgia, rage, self-reproach, lust, denial, and self-mythologizing all on the same record. She was not just documenting a breakup. She was dramatizing emotional chaos as an artistic form. But Red was also a threshold. It revealed a tension she could no longer contain inside genre expectations. The country framework that had first made room for her was beginning to feel too small for what she wanted to build. She was already turning towards something brighter, sharper, and more controlled sonically. The next move would decide whether she became merely a very successful artist or a global force. 1989 was the gamble. It is easy in retrospect to see that album as inevitable. Of course it worked. Of course the songs exploded. Of course she conquered pop. But nothing like that is inevitable from the inside. Reinvention is romanticized after the fact. In real time, it feels like risk. She was leaving behind not just a sound, but a protective frame. Country music had been the home where she first built herself. Pop would be a different arena, less forgiving in some ways, more ruthless in others. If the transition failed, it would be remembered as overreach. Taylor did it anyway. That tells you a great deal about how she operates. She tends to move before the room feels fully ready. She senses when one version of herself has reached its limit and refuses to keep living there for the comfort of others. 1989 was not just a sonic shift. It was an identity shift. The visual language changed. The silhouette changed. The public frequency changed. There was less obvious pleading for understanding and more confidence in self-creation. The songs gleamed. The hooks sharpened. The emotional world became more metropolitan, more ironic, more polished, without losing intelligence. And suddenly, she was no longer simply a crossover success. She was the center of pop gravity. 1989 made Taylor Swift feel unavoidable. Not just successful, but ambient. She was in the bloodstream of the culture. The music was massive. The imagery was everywhere. The squad era began to harden into iconography. Taylor surrounded by beautiful, successful women, photographed like a living editorial fantasy. To fans, it looked aspirational. To critics, it increasingly looked curated to the point of provocation. Everything about her seemed too intact, too effective, too well managed. And when the public begins to feel that a star is too perfectly in control, it starts craving evidence that the control is fake. That is the dark rhythm of fame. The crowd loves ascension, but it is often secretly waiting for gravity. Taylor's 1989 period represented the high point of her early public mastery. She had become one of the most influential women in entertainment, while appearing to manage celebrity with almost unnatural fluency. She knew how to release music, how to create anticipation, how to turn visuals into signals. how to make friendship look mythic, how to give just enough access to feed obsession without surrendering everything. She looked, from the outside, like someone who had solved fame. That illusion would not last, because under the glossy surface, the resentment around her was growing. Some people saw her power and admired it. Others saw the same power and felt manipulated by it. Her whiteness, her privilege, her romantic history, her carefully maintained image, her public feuds, her highly legible symbolism, everything about her made her both massive and vulnerable. She had become not just an artist, but a referendum. People used Taylor Swift to argue about feminism, capitalism, celebrity, authenticity, media narratives, and what kind of woman the culture finds tolerable. Then came 2016. There are years in celebrity culture that feel like chapters. Then there are years that feel like verdicts. For Taylor, 2016 was a verdict year. The conflict with Kanye West, reignited and complicated by Kim Kardashian, erupted into one of the most brutal public reversals of her career. A recorded phone call, conflicting accounts, claims about what had been approved, what had not, what had been understood, and what had been omitted. The specifics mattered, but the larger public reaction mattered more. The internet did what it does best. It collapsed ambiguity into certainty, and the certainty it chose was merciless. Taylor was no longer the interrupted innocent. She was recast as manipulative, calculating, dishonest, a professional victim, a woman who had curated her own saintly image for years, and was finally being exposed. Snake emojis flooded her comment sections. Jokes multiplied. The cultural delight was startling in its intensity. It was not mere criticism. It was gleeful correction. People wanted to believe they had finally found the truth behind the nice girl mask. That reversal hurt her so deeply because it attacked the exact place on which her career rested. Not just her popularity, her credibility, her moral legibility, her relationship to narrative. She had spent years building a public self around sincerity, authorship, and emotional transparency. Now millions of people were saying not only that they disliked her, but that she had never been what she claimed to be. For someone like Taylor Swift, that kind of public redefinition is not just embarrassing, it is existential. This is the point where her story almost breaks. The common fantasy about resilience is that strong people simply keep moving forward in a clean line. But real resilience often begins in retreat. Taylor disappeared, or at least became far less visible. The woman who once knew how to dominate the conversation stepped back from it. And in that absence, something hardened. She was learning a lesson that fame teaches in the cruelest possible way. Being loved by millions is not the same as being safe in their hands. The crowd that once elevated her could also devour her. The old Taylor, the one who believed a clever interview, a gracious smile, a good performance, a beautifully written song, or a little over-explanation could smooth over public hostility, was gone. The next version would be more controlled, more armored, more theatrically defiant. That version arrived in Reputation. If 2016 was the collapse, Reputation was the controlled explosion afterward. It did not come as apology. It came as aesthetic retaliation. Black visuals, snake imagery, tabloid ghosts turned into branding material. The message was clear. If you insist on calling me the villain, I will take the costume and design it better than you ever could. This was one of the most fascinating moves of her career, because it was both defensive and aggressive. It was a shield, but it was also a performance of power. Taylor was not just responding to public humiliation. She was trying to metabolize it artistically. She understood that shame loses some of its force once you make it part of the show. If they were going to use the snake against her, she would make the snake enormous. But Reputation was never just a revenge project. Beneath the aggressive surface was fear, distrust, hypervigilance, loneliness, the sense of having seen the crowd's face change and not being able to unsee it. There was also, unexpectedly, the beginning of something quieter. Private loves that mattered more than people realized at the time. Because one of the strangest things about Taylor Swift's life is that the biggest external moments often correspond to the most private internal shifts. While the world was busy debating her public image, she was learning how much her identity had depended on being seen, and how much she might need spaces where being seen was not the main currency. Joe Alwyn entered that chapter not as dazzling spectacle, but as privacy itself. Someone associated less with public performance and more with shelter from it. Whether or not that relationship would last forever was almost secondary to what it represented in that moment. It was evidence that she could still build a life outside the arena. That possibility changed her, because once you realize the crowd is unreliable, private peace becomes more valuable than public fascination. After reputation came what looked, on the surface, like light, lover, pink skies after black armor, hearts after snakes, color after shadow. But the emotional truth of that era was more complicated than brightness. It felt like a woman trying to reclaim softness without becoming careless again. Joy after humiliation is never the same as innocence before it. It is more deliberate, more fragile, more informed by memory. This period also marked a different kind of awakening in Taylor's career, a sharper public consciousness about power, ownership, and the machinery of the music industry. She had spent years fighting to control her image and narrative. Now another wound would force the question of control into an even more literal form. The sale of her masters was not just business. For Taylor, it hit an old nerve so directly that it became one of the defining conflicts of her adult life. To many observers, it was an industry dispute over rights. To Taylor, it was about authorship at its deepest level. The songs that had carried her through adolescence, fame, humiliation, and reinvention, the songs that made up the public record of her life, were bound up in a structure she did not control. For someone who had insisted on writing since childhood, who had fought to speak in her own voice, and who had already experienced what it meant to lose the narrative publicly, that was unbearable. It was not just the loss of property. It felt like separation from the material evidence of herself. And once again, Taylor responded not merely with anger, but with strategy. The re-recordings were a business maneuver. Yes, they were also something more emotionally and artistically astonishing. She decided to go back through time and reclaim herself, album by album, era by era, not by arguing abstractly for fairness, but by rebuilding the songs from within. It was a radical act of control. Instead of simply mourning what had been taken, she made new masters, new versions, new official memory. Think about what that means psychologically. Imagine standing inside songs you wrote as a teenager, then singing them years later, as a woman who has survived public humiliation, power battles, genre shifts, global obsession, and private heartbreak. You are not merely repeating the past. You are confronting it, revoicing it, deciding what survives. That is part of why the re-recordings resonated so deeply. They were not just about ownership. They were about time. They turned Taylor's career into an active dialogue between past and present selves. The teenager who once wrote to survive and the adult who now writes to reclaim authority were suddenly in the same room. And fans, who had grown up with her, heard those earlier songs differently too. The past was no longer fixed. It could be revised, expanded, and repurposed. Then the world stopped moving in its usual way. The pandemic years scrambled public life, performance, and time itself. Many artists stalled. Taylor pivoted. Folklore arrived like a whispered side door into a completely different mode of being. Gone was the shiny pop spectacle. Gone was the loud argument with the press. In came forests, ghost stories, fictional perspectives, emotional weather, quieter arrangements, and a songwriting voice that seemed almost relieved to be operating at a different temperature. For people who had long dismissed Taylor as a brilliant celebrity who happened to write songs, Folklore and Evermore forced a correction. These albums did not lean on her persona in the usual way. They did not require public relationship drama to function. They revealed something that had always been there, but was now impossible to ignore. Taylor Swift had literary instincts. She could build atmosphere. She could write sideways through characters. She could use fiction not to escape emotion, but to deepen it. This was one of the most elegant pivots of her career, because it reframed her without denying anything that came before. She did not become a different artist. She simply illuminated a chamber of herself that mass culture had not been paying enough attention to. And because the songs were so strong, the move felt less like rebranding and more like revelation. Still, Taylor's life never remains in one mode for long. The minute one narrative settles, another begins to form. Her politics had become more visible. Her silences had been criticized. Then her statements were parsed with equal intensity. This is the burden of being an artist large enough to function as a symbolic figure. You are no longer judged only for what you create. You are judged for what you represent, what you endorse, what you fail to mention, how quickly you react, how consistently you align with the expectations of audiences who all want different things from you. Taylor had to navigate that impossible field while remaining what she fundamentally was, a songwriter, not a movement disguised as a person. Then came Midnights and the return of a more direct pop sheen, but with a different psychology under it. If Folklore and Evermore had wandered through memory as weather, Midnights sounded like the interior monologue of someone awake too late with their own myth. Sleeplessness, regret, vanity, self-accusation, desire, the panic of remembering who you have been. It was not the innocence of Fearless, or the grand rupture of Red, or the sleek conquest of 1989. It was more inward, more aware of the split between public image and nocturnal self. By this point, Taylor Swift had become something larger than a star. She was a system, a cultural force field, a reference point, a woman whose decisions moved markets, whose relationships became news cycles, whose lyrics launched essays and arguments, and whose presence could alter the emotional weather of the internet for days. And then she announced the Eras Tour. It is difficult to explain the Eras Tour without sounding hyperbolic, because the event itself bordered on the hyperbolic. It was not just a concert series. It was a vast, moving retrospective of self-construction, a long-form pageant of memory, a physical argument that every version of Taylor Swift, country dreamer, wounded ingenue, pop architect, villain, lover, woodsy storyteller, sleepless confessor, still belonged to the same artistic organism. That was the conceptual genius of it. After years of reinvention, after years of people acting as though each new Taylor invalidated the last, she staged a show that said, "No, all of it counts. None of these selves were accidents. None of them erased the others. They are eras, not masks left on the floor. They are rooms in the same house." And the world responded with a level of fervor that exceeded even her own history of mass devotion. The tour became a cultural event larger than live music. It was pilgrimage, nostalgia, collective therapy, fashion ritual, intergenerational bonding, economic phenomenon, real-time myth-making. The scale alone was staggering. But scale was not the most interesting part. The most interesting part was what the scale meant. It meant Taylor had done something extraordinarily rare. She had survived long enough and dynamically enough to turn her entire career into an archive people wanted to enter physically. Not just hear, enter, dress for, travel for, cry in. She was no longer merely releasing songs. She was curating memory as an immersive language. And yet, even at this apex, the same tension remained. The more enormous she became, the more the public wanted to reduce her. Her relationships once again became symbols others fought. Her every appearance generated discourse. Her friendships, her timing, her lyrics, and her every public movement all fed the endless interpretive machine. She remained what she had been for years, both profoundly visible and fundamentally overread. This is one of the reasons Taylor Swift fascinates people who are not even fans. She is a study in modern celebrity at its most intense. She lives inside a scale of projection that few people could survive with any coherence. To millions, she is not merely a singer. She is an emotional repository, a fantasy, a cautionary tale, a feminist symbol, a capitalist mastermind, a vulnerable romantic, a strategic genius, an artist, a brand, a narrator, a mirror, sometimes all of those in the same week. Very few people could endure being that many things to that many strangers. Fewer still could continue producing work of real emotional precision while doing it. That precision is what keeps bringing people back. Strip away the spectacle and the headlines, and what remains is the same foundational talent that made her matter at the beginning. She knows how to write the shape of a feeling before most people can even name it in themselves. She knows the difference between saying, "I was sad," and giving the sadness a room, a season, a time of night, a tone of voice, a memory of headlights, a gesture that betrays more than dialogue ever could. That is not ordinary commercial skill. That is narrative intelligence. And it is why so many of the culture's attempts to trivialize her have ultimately failed. People can roll their eyes at fandom. They can mock the Easter eggs. They can dismiss the scale. But songs survive mockery. Songs survive discourse. Songs survive the people who try to reduce them because they continue doing their original work, meeting listeners at the point where language and feeling collide. Still, no biography of Taylor Swift makes sense without the recurring wound of misreading. She has spent an astonishing portion of her life being simultaneously celebrated and misunderstood. Loved for being confessional, then mocked for confessing too clearly. Praised for authenticity, then accused of strategic self-mythologizing the moment her intelligence became too visible. Admired for ambition when it looked inspiring, and resented for ambition when it started looking powerful. This is not unique to her. Exactly. Many women in public life endure versions of it. But in Taylor's case, the pattern became one of the central engines of her work. She writes not just about heartbreak and desire, but about interpretation itself, about the pain of being known in the wrong way, about how stories get told around you, about who gets to define what happened, about how memory can be weaponized, beautified, revised, or reclaimed. That is why authorship remains the key. Not because she controls everything. No artist can control everything, but because her life keeps returning to situations where the battle is over, who gets to write the final version. The teenage girl insisting on writing her own songs. The young woman using clues to create participatory narrative. The public figure interrupted onstage. The celebrity devoured by the 2016 backlash. The artist fighting over masters. The woman re-recording her past. The performer gathering every era into one monumental show. It is the same battle in different costumes. Who gets to tell the story of Taylor Swift? Her genius lies in never abandoning that fight. She keeps going back into the burning house of public narrative and dragging out whatever they tried to leave behind. An old album, an old insult, an old version of herself, and making it usable again. That ability is more than resilience. It is artistic salvage at the highest level. She turns cultural debris into continuity. What should have remained damage becomes material. What should have remained shame becomes motif. But none of that would matter if it did not cost her something. And it clearly has. There is loneliness in Taylor's story that no amount of applause can dissolve. Not ordinary loneliness, but structural loneliness. The loneliness of moving through the world as an institution. The loneliness of not knowing which new person sees you as a person, and which sees the mythology attached to you. The loneliness of falling in love, while millions imagine the breakup before the relationship has even fully begun. The loneliness of being not just watched, but anticipated, predicted, narrated by strangers. That kind of life changes the nervous system. It teaches caution. It rewards control. It can make sincerity feel risky, and privacy feel precious. It is not difficult to imagine why Taylor became more strategic over time. People sometimes say the word calculated, as if calculation automatically cancels feeling. But in her case, calculation often looks like adaptation. The more public pain she experienced, the more she learned to protect the edges of herself. And yet, for all that protection, she never stopped making work that reaches toward connection. That is the deepest contradiction in her life, and maybe the secret source of her staying power. She became one of the most image-aware celebrities alive, yet her art still depends on emotional permeability. She needs to feel enough to write. She needs to risk enough to sound true. She needs to let the world hear pain, longing, shame, desire, regret, jealousy, nostalgia, and fantasy moving through her. If she sealed herself completely, the songs would die. So she cannot. Instead, she keeps negotiating the boundary between exposure and self-preservation. That boundary is never fixed. Sometimes she invites the audience right up to the door. Sometimes she disappears behind it. Sometimes she uses fiction as camouflage. Sometimes she uses confessional intimacy as bait. Sometimes she turns the spotlight into a mirror. Sometimes she makes the mirror look like smoke. This flexibility is not inconsistency. It is survival art. And the thing about survival art is that it often reads as reinvention from the outside. People love to talk about Taylor's eras as if they are costumes hanging in sequence. But each era is also a response to pressure. Each one answers a different threat, solves a different problem, or asks a new question about what kind of self can exist under these conditions. Fearless asks how hope survives embarrassment. Speak Now asks how authorship survives dismissal. Red asks how identity survives contradiction. 1989 asks how self-creation survives mass visibility. Reputation asks how dignity survives public hatred. Lover asks how tenderness survives armor. Folklore and Evermore ask how imagination survives overexposure. Midnights asks how the self survives its own memory. The re-recordings ask how the past survives ownership battles. The Eras Tour asks whether all the fragments can survive long enough to stand in one body again. That is why the story remains addictive. It is not static. It keeps converting damage into structure. And damage, in Taylor Swift's life, has never arrived cleanly. It comes mixed with success. That is another reason people remain fascinated by her. The brightest chapters are never free of shadow. Her greatest public victories often coincide with the most punishing invasions. Her biggest romantic moments become future public evidence. Her clearest artistic breakthroughs come after collapses. Even her dominance carries a tremor underneath it, because the audience remembers, consciously or not, that she has fallen before. They know it could happen again. That possibility charges the myth. Everyone loves a winner, but they become obsessed with a survivor. Taylor Swift became more than a winner the moment 2016 did not kill her career. That was the hinge. Before then, she was huge. After then, she became narratively indestructible in a new way. Not invincible. No one at her scale is invincible, but able to turn near catastrophe into future architecture. Once the crowd has already tried to shame you out of existence, and you return with a stadium show built from every identity they ever mocked, the relationship changes. The audience may still criticize you, but it now does so in the shadow of your capacity to survive. This survival does not mean the wound disappears. It remains in her timing, her caution, her reflex for control, her periodic disappearances, her insistence on managing how history is told. The mistake that almost ended her career did not vanish when the tides turned. It became a ghost in the system, a permanent memory that public affection is reversible, that you can be a darling on Monday and a meme by Thursday. That explanation is not always heard. That millions of people may decide your motive before you have finished speaking. When a person learns that lesson at Taylor's level of exposure, it shapes everything afterward. And yet, ghost as it is, that moment also intensified some of her finest qualities. It made her more daring strategically. It forced her to separate real connection from public approval. It pushed her toward privacy in ways that protected the emotional core needed to keep making art. It transformed ownership from abstract value into active mission. It gave her a harder edge and a more patient sense of narrative time. She learned that she did not have to win every day if she could outlast the current cycle. She learned to think in chapters, not merely in headlines. That capacity for long-form thinking may be the single most underrated aspect of her genius. Taylor Swift does not merely react. She sequences. She foreshadows. She withholds. She understands payoff. She can take an insult from one year and make it part of the triumph of another. She can take an overlooked song and turn it into an anthem years later. She can recontextualize a whole period of her life by changing how it is framed. That is not just music career management. It is narrative engineering. And like all great narrative engineers, she understands suspense. Why does the world keep watching Taylor Swift? Because even when she is overexposed, she remains narratively unresolved. There is always another turn, another hidden meaning, another song that seems to confirm one reading while undermining another shift in tone, another period of visibility, followed by strategic disappearance, another love story, another rupture, another claim over her past, another battle about what she means. She has created a career that moves with the pull of serialized fiction, not because she is fake, but because she is unusually adept at recognizing that public life is story-shaped, whether you want it to be or not. Many celebrities get destroyed by that fact. Taylor learned to work with it, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes imperfectly, but always actively. That does not make her robotic. If anything, the opposite. Her work would not resonate so deeply if there were not real feeling underneath the structure. What makes her unusual is the coexistence of intense feeling and intense management. Most people are one or the other in public imagination. They are either messy and sincere or polished and strategic. Taylor has always been both. That unsettles people. They want women to be one thing at a time, innocent or calculating, warm or ambitious, vulnerable or powerful. Taylor's life keeps refusing those binaries, and the refusal itself becomes provocative. Take the romantic mythology that follows her. People speak about Taylor's relationships as though they explain her. They do not. They reveal her at moments. Yes, they matter. They inspire songs. They shape chapters. But her most enduring relationship is not with any individual man. It is with story. with the act of meaning-making, with the conversion of chaos into a form that can be sung, sold, shared, argued over, and remembered. That is why breakups do not merely end in her world. They become artifacts. They change shape and enter a larger archive. A relationship may dissolve, but the emotional residue will likely return later in a line that makes a listener stop breathing for half a second, because it says exactly what they once felt and never managed to say. This ability has made her seem almost supernatural to fans. But it is, in another sense, brutally human. She does what many people wish they could do with pain: turn it into meaning before it curdles into waste. That is the fantasy at the center of her appeal. Not just being loved, or admired, or famous, but being able to use suffering so completely that it becomes part of the architecture of your power. Taylor Swift is what that fantasy looks like when taken to its most culturally explosive conclusion. But fantasies always hide costs. To turn life into material on this scale means that very little stays untouched by interpretation. Memory becomes a resource, but also a trap. You revisit old wounds for art and commerce, but in revisiting them, you also reopen them. You transform personal history into a public product, but then the public feels entitled to claim a piece of the history back. You become a curator of your own life, but the museum never closes. This, too, is part of the haunting. The past does not simply stay past in Taylor's world. It remains active. Old songs return. Old feuds are re-examined. Old interviews resurface. Old visual motifs acquire new meaning. Her career has become so layered, so recursive, that time in her artistic universe feels less linear than circular. A song written at 19 may gain a second life at 33. A public insult from one era may become a triumphant visual reference in another. A lyric that once sounded romantic may later sound devastating in light of new context. That kind of temporal layering is artistically rich. It is also psychologically intense. It means Taylor is never only living in the present. She is continuously in dialogue with her former selves. The child who loved country songs, the teen who wanted Nashville, the young woman accepting an award mid-interruption, the pop conqueror, the canceled celebrity, the snake, the lover, the exile in the woods, the sleepless narrator, the owner reclaiming the catalog, the woman standing in front of tens of thousands of people every night, singing versions of herself back into one body. No wonder the story feels larger than celebrity. It functions like modern epic. And yet, what prevents it from becoming distant or abstract is that the emotional stakes remain recognizable. You do not have to be Taylor Swift to know what it means to feel misread. You do not have to be a megastar to know the sting of watching someone else define your motives. You do not have to own masters to know what it feels like to have your work separated from your control. You do not have to survive global backlash to understand the panic of public embarrassment or social exile in miniature. Scale changes the spectacle. It does not erase the underlying emotion. That is why the songs keep working. They keep translating the enormous back into the personal. This translation is, in many ways, Taylor's most radical achievement. She took things culture often treats as unserious: girlhood, heartbreak, romantic fantasy, jealousy, longing, social humiliation, memory, and proved they could sustain not only art, but empires. She made emotional intelligence commercially devastating. She built one of the most powerful careers in music, not by distancing herself from feeling, but by getting more exact about it than almost anyone else. An industry that has long undervalued the emotional worlds associated with young women ended up being economically transformed by an artist who centered precisely those worlds. The songs that adults once mocked as diary entries became generational reference points. The fan base once condescended to became one of the most organized, loyal, and economically potent forces in entertainment. The details once dismissed as petty turned out to be the very thing that made the art durable. Taylor did not simply benefit from that shift. She forced part of it. Of course, power changes how an artist is read. Once Taylor became truly massive, some people stopped hearing vulnerability and started hearing strategy everywhere. That response is understandable. She is strategic. She is highly image-conscious. She understands release timing, fan psychology, symbolism, and public expectation with unusual sophistication. But the lazy conclusion many people reach, that strategy cancels sincerity, is far too simple. In Taylor's case, strategy often exists to protect sincerity. It allows her to keep making intimate work without letting the entire world own every inch of her. That balance is never perfect. Sometimes the machinery becomes too visible. Sometimes the symbolism is overdetermined. Sometimes her scale makes even honest feeling look staged, because very little at that level can appear spontaneous anymore. But even these imperfections are part of what makes her interesting. She is not a natural mystic floating above celebrity. She is a working artist managing celebrity as best she can, while still trying to make art that reaches people cleanly. And often, somehow, it does. Look at the way listeners attach to different Taylor eras, depending on where they met her. For some, she is forever the fearless girl with a guitar, trying to narrate adolescence before it swallows her. For others, she is the writer of Red, making emotional contradiction feel almost holy. For others, she is the 1989 architect, proving she could rebuild herself at pop scale. For others, she is the Reputation survivor, taking venom and turning it into spectacle. For others, she is the folklore novelist, finally forcing skeptics to hear the literary force inside the songs. For still others, she is the woman on stage during the Eras tour, holding all those selves in one frame and making thousands cry because they suddenly see their own years reflected there too. That multiplicity is not a branding gimmick. It is the core of why Taylor Swift endures. She has allowed enough transformation that people can enter her work from different doors. Some artists give one version of themselves so completely that fans either grow with that version or leave. Taylor kept opening new rooms. She evolved without fully abandoning the old architecture. That is rare, harder than it looks, and emotionally complicated because every new room risks angering the people who loved the previous one. She did it anyway. It is worth pausing on the courage required for that. Not performative courage, artistic courage under conditions of intense visibility. To pivot genres when millions are ready to accuse you of opportunism. To withdraw when the public wants your reaction. To return without apology when the crowd expected collapse. To revisit your own catalog and say, this still belongs to me. To write fictional songs when people insist every lyric must be literal. To stand inside your own mythology and refuse to let the mythology become the whole truth. That courage is not always glamorous. Sometimes it looks like pettiness to outsiders. Sometimes like overcontrol. Sometimes like not letting go. But from another angle, those same traits look like a woman refusing to abandon her own history to the simplifications of strangers. And maybe that is the most coherent way to understand Taylor Swift. Not as untouchable, not as always right, not as a pure victim, not as a mastermind without feeling, but as someone engaged in a lifelong struggle to remain the primary author of a story the world constantly tries to co-write. This struggle produces friction. It also produces art. A lesser artist might have been flattened permanently by the public contradictions around her. Too polished to be relatable, too emotional to be respectable, too famous to be trusted, too strategic to be innocent, too sincere to be cynical, too feminine to be granted default seriousness, too successful to be pitied. Taylor took all those contradictions and made them part of the engine. The accusations did not disappear, but she kept folding them into the work, transforming external narratives into interior themes. That is why certain lines in her songs hit so hard. They do not just describe romance or grief. They carry the vibration of someone who has lived under interpretation long enough to know that injury often comes not from what happened, but from how it gets narrated afterward. Anyone who has ever felt wrongly summarized can hear that frequency in her work. Maybe that is the reason people feel so fiercely protective of her, or so fiercely irritated by her, or sometimes both. She triggers questions far beyond music. What does authenticity look like in a media-saturated age? Can a person be deeply sincere and intensely strategic at the same time? What are women punished for more? Being ambitious or pretending not to be? How much of confession is performance? And how much performance is simply confession shaped for survival? At what point does a celebrity stop being an individual in the public imagination and become infrastructure for everyone else's arguments? Taylor Swift does not answer those questions cleanly. She embodies them, and embodiment is always messier than theory. That messiness is why the story still has suspense. For all her power, Taylor remains vulnerable to the same force that nearly ruined her before. Public reinterpretation. The crowd still watches, still waits, still decides. One wrong moment, one badly timed silence, One overplayed narrative beat, one new backlash cycle, and the conversation could darken again. Maybe not in exactly the same way as 2016. History rarely repeats in identical costume, but the possibility of reversal never fully disappears at her level. That is part of the charge around her fame. She stands at a height from which every move looks legendary or precarious, depending on where you stand. And yet she continues. She continues because songwriting remains older and more reliable than public opinion. Because there is still, somewhere underneath the systems and strategies, that girl who believed words could rescue a feeling from oblivion. Because writing lets her get there first. Because when she cannot control what people say about her, she can still make something truer than the headlines. Because the page, the melody, the line break, the bridge, the hook, these things are still forms of order in a life that has often been defined by disorder. This is what makes the biography more than gossip, more than chronology. The life makes sense not simply as a list of achievements and feuds, but as the story of someone who built a way of processing reality, powerful enough to withstand repeated distortion. Taylor Swift's songs do not erase what happens to her. They metabolize it. They do not make her invulnerable. They make her legible to herself again. That is a profound function for art to serve. It is also probably what has kept her alive inside the machine, because the machine is immense now, bigger than perhaps even she imagined in the beginning. Fans no longer merely love the songs. They study release calendars, hidden references, outfits, speeches, legal filings, acoustic song choices, visual callbacks, stage design changes, and social alignments. They have become archivists, detectives, celebrants, myth interpreters. To be Taylor Swift now is to exist inside a permanent state of collective interpretation. It is intense. It is unstable. It is lucrative. It is likely exhausting. But there is also something beautiful in it when viewed from the right angle. Millions of people gathered around language, around memory, around feeling, around the belief that a line in a song can explain a year of your life better than your own speech ever did. Taylor did not invent that hunger, but she has fed it better than almost anyone. And still, underneath the empire, the original wound remains visible if you look carefully enough. The need not merely to be seen, but to be seen correctly. The fear that misreading is a form of theft. The determination to keep telling the story before someone else tells it smaller. The knowledge that affection can turn. The refusal to let that possibility stop the work. Everyone thinks Taylor Swift is untouchable, but that was never the true source of her power. Her power comes from the fact that she has been touched by nearly everything that could have broken her. Public humiliation, ridicule, overexposure, dismissal, betrayal, industry politics, narrative theft, the volatility of mass opinion. And she kept finding a way to make the wound sing before it hardened into silence. That is harder than winning, harder than staying famous, harder than writing hits. And it is why her story still grips people who swear they are tired of hearing about her. Because even when they roll their eyes, they can sense the scale of the drama underneath. They can sense that this is not just another pop career. It is an ongoing argument between a woman and the stories told about her. A war over authorship conducted through hooks and headlines, kisses and courtships, feuds and legal rights, diaries and stage lights, forests and midnight confessions, memory and money and music and myth. There are easier ways to become a celebrity than the way Taylor Swift became Taylor Swift. There are safer ways to write songs than the way she writes them. There are calmer ways to move through the world than to invite millions of people into a code-filled emotional universe, and then keep trying to hold onto yourself inside it. But she chose this path early, maybe before she could fully know the scale of the consequences. She chose authorship. She chose feeling. She chose ambition. She chose to treat the things that happen to girls as worthy of epic treatment. She chose to keep building, even after the building collapsed on her once in public. And that is why the story feels inexhaustible. Because every time you think it is over, another frame appears, another angle, another rereading, another turn where the apparently settled meaning becomes unstable again. Was she the victim, or the strategist, the romantic, or the archivist, the people pleaser, or the power player, the confessional writer, or the architect of carefully managed intimacy? The answer, maddening and compelling, is yes, often all at once. Few public figures are large enough to hold that much contradiction without breaking. Fewer still can turn contradiction into art. Taylor Swift has done it so consistently that contradiction now feels like one of her native languages. So if you want the clean version of her life, the simple version, the version where the gifted girl moved to Nashville, wrote songs, became famous, took some hits, came back stronger, and conquered the world, you can have that. It is not false. It is just too small. The truer version is messier and much more interesting. A child who wanted words before she wanted applause. A teenager who understood that authorship was power. A young star interrupted in front of millions and transformed into a symbol overnight. A songwriter praised for confession and mocked for the exact same thing. A woman who crossed genres because staying still felt more dangerous than change. A public darling who became a public target. A celebrity nearly buried by a backlash she could not control. An artist who turned the snake into a stage prop and the insult into a chorus. A businesswoman who refused to surrender her catalog as a closed chapter. A writer who disappeared into fictional woods and emerged more respected than before. A performer who assembled every previous self into one spectacular argument for continuity. A person who learned that being adored does not mean being safe and made art anyway. That is Taylor Swift's biography at its most compelling. Not a fairy tale, not a cautionary tale, not a clean empowerment narrative either. Something stranger. A life in which feeling became currency, language became armor, memory became territory, and every attempt to define her too narrowly became the seed of her next transformation. The one mistake that almost ended her career still haunts her today, because it taught her the one lesson people at the top are never supposed to forget. The crowd can change, the myth can crack, the narrative can turn faster than your own pulse. Once you know that, you never step onto the stage the same way again. But perhaps that is also why the stage grew so large. Because after learning how fragile public love could be, Taylor stopped building only for love. She started building for endurance, for legacy, for control, for the right to define the shape of her own archive. She built something stronger than popularity. She built a world in which even her worst public moments could become part of the architecture, rather than the end of it. And that may be the most astonishing twist in all of this. The thing that almost destroyed Taylor Swift did not make her disappear. It made her harder to erase. It made her more deliberate, more suspicious, more strategic, more self-protective. Yes, but it also made her more formidable. It taught her the value of patience, the danger of overexposure, the necessity of ownership, the power of withdrawal, the usefulness of silence, and the thrill of returning with something no one expected. It forced her to discover whether there was still a self beneath the applause. There was. And it was even better at writing than the world remembered. So the image that remains is not just the woman in the stadium, or the woman in the headlines, or the woman in the sparkly dress accepting an award. It is the writer, alone with the feeling before it becomes public, alone with the line before it becomes an anthem, alone with the wreckage before it becomes an era. That is where Taylor Swift's life keeps beginning again, no matter how many times the world thinks it already knows the ending. Because for Taylor, the ending is never where the real story lives. The real story lives in the moment after humiliation, when she decides whether to disappear or to write. In the moment after being misread, when she decides whether to explain or to transform it. In the moment after losing control, when she decides whether to mourn or to rebuild. In the moment after becoming too visible, when she decides whether to hide or to reinvent. And every time, in one form or another, she chooses the same thing. She writes the crush before it fades. She writes the heartbreak before it hardens into silence. She writes the insult before it defines her. She writes the memory before someone else gets there first. She writes the new version before the old one can trap her permanently. That is why Taylor Swift remains so compelling, so irritating, so beloved, so overanalyzed, and so impossible to simplify. Not because she is untouchable, because she keeps touching the fire and coming back with a song.